The air in the VIP lounge was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the heavy, metallic tang of fear. Joy Maddle's hands trembled as she tilted the crystal decanter, her eyes fixed resolutely on the plush carpet, trying to remain invisible to the men who ruled this room. Her deep red satin dress felt like a target, the thin straps digging into her warm brown skin as the humidity of the crowded space rose. She was an outsider here, a civilian in a world where mercy was a fatal flaw. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you," a voice rasped. It was the man in the silk suit, a high-ranking political ally Dang T who had spent months courting to solidify the Chinses syndicate's influence. Before Joy could retreat, his hand clamped around her wrist with bruising force. The wine bottle slipped from her numb fingers, crashing against the mahogany table. The sound of breaking glass echoed like a gunshot through the silent lounge. Joy's breath hitched, and the scream died in her throat as the black-clothed guards at the door remained motionless, their faces like carved stone. "Please," she whispered, her wide eyes seeking any sign of humanity in the room. It was an accident. The man didn't let go. Instead, his grip tightened, pulling her toward him until she could smell the stale alcohol on his breath. The men around the table laughed, a cruel, discordant sound that made Joy's blood run cold. She was trapped in a luxury nightmare, bound by a terror she couldn't outrun. Then, the heavy oak doors swung open. Dang T Hu stepped into the light, and the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly to one of predatory focus. He was tall, his black tailored suit fitting his broad shoulders with surgical precision, the white shirt beneath unbuttoned just enough to reveal the black ink of tattoos crawling up his neck and across his chest. His dark hair was slightly tousled, masking eyes that were usually as cold and implacable as a winter storm. T Hu lived by 3 unbreakable laws: trust no one outside the organization. Business never becomes personal. And never, under any circumstances, involve the syndicate in civilian affairs. These rules had made him the youngest and most feared boss in the history of the syndicate. But as his gaze fell on Joy, wide-eyed, trembling, her long braids cascading over her tense shoulders, T Hu felt his legendary certainty crack. He didn't see the millions of dollars the man in the silk suit represented for his financial network. He saw only the terror in Joy's eyes and the bruising grip on her delicate wrist. T Hu moved with a deadly grace that silenced the room. Without a word, he crossed the floor, shattering the no-interference rule with every step. He didn't negotiate. He simply reached out, his hand closing over the arm of his ally with lethal precision. The sound of bone snapping followed the previous sound of breaking glass. "You're making a mistake, T Hu," the man shrieked, clutching his arm as he collapsed. "She's just a waitress. You're breaking the code for nobody." T Hu didn't look at the fallen man. He stood closely behind Joy, one arm wrapping firmly around her waist to steady her swaying torso, his other hand lingering near her shoulder in a gesture that was both possessive and protective. "The code is mine," T Hu said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "And she is no longer a civilian. She is mine." The tires of the black sedan hissed against the pavement as the city blurred into distorted streaks of neon. Inside, the silence was thick, charged with the lingering, metallic tang of the violence they'd just escaped. Dang T Hu sat beside Joy, his presence a heavy weight in the darkened cabin. He had not let go of her hand since they left the lounge, his grip was firm and possessive, a silent claim that made Joy's pulse race with a mixture of terror and disbelief. They bypassed the main lobby of his glass and steel skyscraper, the car sliding into a private elevator that ascended with a silent, nauseating speed. When the doors opened, Joy was met with a sprawling luxury penthouse. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the glittering Seattle skyline, the city lights spread out like fallen stars. It was a masterpiece of cold, expensive lines and minimalist design, but to Joy, it felt like the belly of a predator. She stood in the center of the room, her deep red satin dress a vibrant, wounded splash of color against the white marble. "You can't keep me here," Joy whispered, her voice cracking as she finally pulled her hand from his. "I have a life. I have shifts at the restaurant. My sister." "Your life as you knew it ended the moment that man put his hands on you," T Hu interrupted, his voice like gravel. He shed his tailored black jacket, tossing it onto a leather chair. Without the coat, the extensive black tattoos crawling up his neck and across his chest were fully exposed, the ink dark against his skin in the dim light. The man I crippled tonight is a snake with a long memory. If I let you walk back to your apartment, you wouldn't survive until dawn. Joy backed away, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. Her wide eyes took in the high security locks and the silent guards stationed at the elevator. So what is this? A rescue or a kidnapping? Tihu stepped toward her, his height looming and his eyes lowered toward her with a mix of protectiveness and a restrained, burning emotion. It's a reality you're not prepared for. He reached out, his fingers hovering near her long, neat braids before dropping away as if he were battling his own morals. By saving you, I shattered a political alliance that took years to build. I broke my own rules for a woman I don't even know. My enemies don't see a waitress anymore, Joy. They see a target. They see my greatest vulnerability. He turned toward the window, looking out at the city he ruled through fear. They will come for you to get to me. This isn't a guest room. It's a stronghold. He looked back at her, his expression intense and conflicted, his body language signaling a dominance that was now destabilized by something he couldn't yet name. You are under my protection now. And in my world, that means you are mine to hide, mine to guard, and mine to keep. Whether you're ready for this golden cage or not. Joy looked at the sprawling city below. It was beautiful, vast, and suddenly, completely out of reach. She was no longer a face in the crowd, she was the most dangerous piece on Dang Tihu's board. Joy sat on the edge of the velvet sofa in the sprawling penthouse, her fingers tracing the hem of her red dress as she watched the man who had upended her life. In the soft glow of the office lamps, Dang Tihu sat behind a sleek mahogany desk, his focus buried in a laptop. He had discarded his suit jacket, and the white silk of his unbuttoned shirt fell away to reveal the raw, ink-etched canvas of his skin. From this distance, Joy could see that the tattoos weren't just art, they were a roadmap of survival. A long, jagged scar bisected the dragon's tail on his shoulder, a remnant of a blade that should have taken his life when he was only 15. She remembered the whispers she'd heard in the service hallways of the city's elite about the dragon of the Chintz's syndicate. They said he had been forged in a closet, forced to listen to the muffled sounds of his father begging for mercy while his mother sobbed, a lesson in the lethality of trust. He had learned early that compassion was a fatal mistake. By 32, he had ascended to the throne of the syndicate through 3 unbreakable laws: trust no one outside the organization, business never becomes personal, and all debts are collected with cold-blooded precision. What are you looking at? Tihu's voice cut through the silence, low and dangerous. He didn't look up from the screen, yet he seemed to feel her gaze as if it were a physical touch. The rules, Joy whispered, her voice echoing in the vast, cold space. Everyone says you're stone cold. That you're a man of logic and no heart. He finally raised his eyes, the intensity in them making Joy's breath hitch. Logic keeps you alive in a world where everyone is a predator. My father showed compassion to his most trusted associates and was rewarded with 3 bullets and an unmarked grave. He stood up, moving with a deadly grace that signaled his absolute dominance over the space. The Chintz's syndicate doesn't run on feelings, Joy. It runs on the certainty that I will eliminate any threat that compromises our strength. Joy felt the weight of those words settle over her like lead. She wasn't just in a luxury apartment, she was in the lair of a man who had built an entire empire on isolation. The stone-cold legend wasn't just a title, it was a fortress he had built to ensure no one could ever reach him again. Looking at the unyielding line of his jaw, she realized that by saving her, he hadn't just broken a minor code, he had challenged the very foundation of his survival. She was in the hands of the most dangerous man in the city, a man used to total control, who was now visibly destabilized by the very woman he had sworn he would never notice. Morning light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling glass, cold and sharp, catching the dust motes dancing in the silent penthouse. Joy emerged from the guest suite, her steps hesitant on the polished marble. She had expected to find a fleet of servants or at least the intimidating presence of his guards, but the vast living area was empty of everyone except him. Dang Tihu stood in the kitchen area, his white shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink of dragons twisting around his forearms. He was focused on an espresso machine, operating the chrome levers with a surgical precision that seemed at odds with his reputation for violence. The rich, bitter aroma of dark roast began to fill the sterile air. "I need coffee," Joy said, her voice sounding small in the cavernous room. Tihu didn't startle. He didn't even turn around. He simply reached for a second porcelain cup. "You're demanding things," he noted, though there was no heat in his voice. "If you're going to keep me in a golden cage, the least you can do is provide caffeine," she countered, crossing her arms over her chest. She watched him move, fascinated by the domesticity of the act. "I didn't expect the most dangerous man in Seattle to make his own espresso." "Don't you have people for that?" Tihu set the cup down and finally turned to face her. His intense eyes lowered toward her, flickering with a mix of that strange protectiveness and something darker. "I don't trust people in my personal space," he said quietly, his voice a low vibration that made her skin prickle. "In my world, poison is a very popular way to settle debts." Joy took the cup he offered, her fingers briefly brushing against his. The heat of his skin sent a jolt through her, more potent than the caffeine. "That's a lonely way to live," she whispered. "Lonely men don't get betrayed," he replied, repeating a mantra that had clearly been his shield for years. But Joy didn't look away. She took a sip of the coffee, strong, black, and perfect, and leaned against the counter, closing the distance he tried so hard to maintain. "They also don't get to live," she said softly, echoing a truth she could see reflected in the cold perfection of his home. A faint twitch at the corner of Tihu's mouth, not quite a smile, but a crack in the stone, suggested her simple humanity was doing what his enemies never could, destabilizing his control. For a moment, the boss of the Chintz's syndicate wasn't a predator, he was just a man sharing a morning with a woman he was beginning to realize he couldn't let go of. The silence between them shifted, no longer thick with the metallic tang of fear, but with a new, dangerous kind of electricity. "Focus, Joy," he said, his voice dropping an octave as he stepped closer, his body language signaling a dominance that felt increasingly like a desire to be near her. "The world outside hasn't forgotten you just because we're having coffee. This is still a war." "Then let's make it a war worth winning," she replied, her wide-eyed anxiety finally giving way to a quiet, stubborn determination. The peace within the glass walls was short-lived, shattered not by a sound, but by the sudden, eerie flickering of the penthouse security monitors. The man in the silk suit, the political ally who had crippled, was not merely a businessman, he was a spider with deep connections into the city's legislative heart. By mid-afternoon, the stone-cold boss received a frantic update from his security detail, a specialized task force, bought and paid for by his former allies' political reach, had been dispatched to retrieve Joy under the guise of an emergency welfare check. "They aren't coming to rescue you, Joy," Tihu said, his voice dropping into a register of lethal calculation as he checked the slide of his firearm. He moved across the room, his body language shifting into the predatory focus of the man the syndicate called the Dragon. "They are coming to take my leverage. In their eyes, you are a piece of evidence that needs to be erased." The attack was sophisticated, a coordinated breach that targeted the penthouse's private elevator and the service stairwell simultaneously. The heavy thud of flashbangs echoed through the hallways, and the metallic tang of smoke began to bleed into the scent of Joy's perfume. Joy backed into the corner of the office, her wide eyes fixed on the door as the first wave of armed men in tactical gear burst through. Tihu didn't hesitate. He stood between Joy and the door, his tall frame a shield of tailored wool and ink-etched skin. He moved with a surgical precision that seemed almost inhuman, a blur of motion that neutralized the first two intruders before they could even level their weapons. When a stray bullet shattered a decorative vase inches from Joy's head, showering her deep red dress in shards of porcelain, Tihu's restraint snapped. The conflict wasn't just business anymore, it was a personal war. He caught the third man by the throat, his grip echoing the possessive dominance Joy had seen in the VIP lounge. "Tell your master," Tihu hissed, his eyes blazing with a mix of obsession and rage, "that every hand he sends after her will be returned to him in a box." Once the room was cleared and the secondary security team, led by his loyal guards, moved to secure the perimeter, Tihu turned to Joy. She was trembling, her shoulders tense as she looked at the carnage in her new home. He stepped toward her, his hand hovering near her waist, steadying her as she swayed. I told you, he whispered, his voice gentled by an unfamiliar note of care. My world is dangerous. But now, my world is yours. Joy looked at the blood on his white shirt and then up into his intense, conflicted eyes. She realized then that a stone-cold boss wasn't just her protector, he was her gravity. Her simple life as a waitress had been swallowed by the shadows of the Chinsa's syndicate, and for the first time, she wasn't sure if she wanted to find her way back. The lines between victim and partner were starting to blur in the heat of the smoke and the silence of the penthouse. The scent of gun smoke still lingered in the vents, a bitter reminder that the penthouse was no longer a sanctuary but a fortress under siege. Dang Ti-Hu stood by the window, his silhouette dark against the Seattle skyline, the white silk of his shirt stained with the sweat and grit of the afternoon's violence. His second-in-command, a man named Quan whose loyalty had been forged in the same blood-soaked streets as Ti-Hu's own rise, paced the marble floor with a restless, predatory energy. The council is screaming, Ti-Hu, Quan rasped, his voice tight with a frustration that bordered on insubordination. They're saying you've gone soft, that this girl is a distraction we can't afford. Yoon and the others are already spreading poison, claiming you're compromised by a civilian. Quan stopped, his eyes flicking toward the corner where Joy sat, her shoulders tense and her hands hovering near the waist of her ruined red dress. Hand her over. Give the politician his evidence back, and we can mend the alliance before the council votes to replace you. Ti-Hu didn't move. His hand, etched with the tail of a dragon, clenched into a fist at his side. She is under my protection, Quan. That is not a negotiation. It's a death sentence. Quan stepped closer, his body language aggressive. You're breaking every rule we built this syndicate on for a woman who doesn't even belong in our world. Joy watched them, her wide eyes moving between the two men. As a waitress, she had spent years becoming an expert in the subtle language of human behavior, the way a customer's eyes shifted when they were about to skip a check, or the specific tension in a shoulder that signaled a hidden agenda. While Ti-Hu was blinded by the loyalty of his oldest friend, Joy noticed the anomaly. Quan's phone buzzed on the mahogany table. It was a brief, silver flash, but Joy saw the screen light up. It wasn't a standard encrypted syndicate line. The metadata on the lock screen was a specific authorization code, one she had seen on the VIP guest list at the lounge earlier that week, belonging to the pervert's lead security detail. He's lying, Joy said, her voice small but remarkably steady in the cavernous room. Ti-Hu turned, his intense, conflicted gaze falling on her. Joy, stay out of this. No, she insisted, standing up and moving toward the table, her braids cascading over her shoulders. You told me you don't trust people in your personal space because poison is popular. Well, the poison is already here. She pointed to Quan's phone. I saw that same contact ID at the lounge. He isn't trying to save the alliance, Ti-Hu. He's already sold the coordinates of this penthouse to the men who just tried to kill us. Silence stretched, thick and dangerous. Quan went very still, his expression shifting from concerned friend to cornered predator. Ti-Hu's eyes narrowed, his mind racing through the implications of Joy's observation. For the first time, the stone-cold boss looked at his second-in-command and didn't see a brother, he saw a traitor who had used Joy as a smokescreen for his own grab at power. Quan, Ti-Hu said, his voice dropping into a register that made the air itself seem to freeze. Show me the phone. The air between them crackled with electricity, and Joy realized that by using her observant waitress eyes, she had just accelerated the timeline of a war she wasn't sure they could win. The city lights spread below them like fallen stars, Seattle's skyline glittering with a cold, uncaring beauty. On the penthouse balcony, the wind was sharp, pulling at Joy's long braids and cooling the heat that still burned in her cheeks from the confrontation with Quan. Dang Ti-Hu stood at the railing, his silhouette carved from stone, his unbuttoned white shirt fluttering against his ink-etched skin. He looked like a king surveying an empire he was suddenly willing to set on fire. You should be inside, he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to harmonize with the distant hum of the city. He didn't turn to look at her, but Joy knew he felt her presence, she had become the one anomaly in his perfectly calculated world. I couldn't breathe in there, Joy whispered, stepping closer until she could smell the faint scent of his expensive cologne masking the darker metallic tang of danger. Quan was your brother. He was someone you trusted for years. And you chose to believe me, a waitress you've known for only a few days. Tihu finally turned, his intense, conflicted eyes lowering toward her with a mix of protectiveness and restrained emotion. The predatory focus was still there, but it was tempered by a raw, unshielded honesty that made Joy's breath catch. I built this empire on isolation, Joy. Trust no one, feel nothing. It kept me alive while I watched everyone else around me burn for their weaknesses. My rules were supposed to be unbreakable. Then why did you break them? Joy asked, her wide eyes seeking answers as she challenged the fortress he had built around his heart. You could have handed me over. You could have saved your political alliance and kept your seat on the council. Why risk a war for someone you barely know? Tihu moved with that sudden, deadly grace, closing the distance between them until Joy was trapped between his heat and the cold night air. He reached out, his hand lingering against her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt like a confession. I told myself you were leverage. I told myself your safety was a tactical decision to keep my enemies from finding a way to hurt me. But those were just lies. I told myself to stay strong. His eyes darkened, his grip on her waist becoming both possessive and protective. I didn't save you because of a business debt, Joy. I saved you because, for the first time in 15 years, I wanted to break my own rules. I wanted to see if there was something worth more than survival. In my world, love is the fastest way to die, he whispered, his lips inches from hers, the air between them crackling with an electricity that felt like a prelude to a storm. Then your world is lonely, Joy replied softly, her hands hovering near his chest as she looked up at the man used to total control, now destabilized by her presence. And lonely men never truly get to live. The first physical spark ignited between them, a desperate, hungry collision of two worlds that should never have met. In that moment, the stone-cold boss realized he wasn't just protecting a waitress, he was fighting for the only piece of humanity he had left. The tension in the office was a physical weight, heavier than the bulletproof glass of the penthouse windows. Quan sat under the harsh light of the desk lamp, his face a mask of wounded outrage, while Tihu's guards stood behind him like shadows. Tihu himself remained in the gloom, his unbuttoned white shirt revealing the dark dragons on his chest that seemed to writhe with every shallow breath he took. He wanted to believe the man who had bled beside him for a decade, but the doubt Joy had planted was a poison of its own. You're going to take the word of a girl you plucked off a restaurant floor over mine? Quan spat, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. Tihu, look at me. I'm your brother. She's a distraction. Tihu didn't answer. His intense, conflicted eyes remained lowered toward Joy, seeking a certainty he no longer possessed. Joy stood near the mahogany desk, her warm brown skin glowing in the lamplight, her fingers nervously twisting one of her long braids. She felt out of place in this world of blood and cold-blooded precision, but she knew what she had seen. It wasn't just the phone, Joy said, her voice growing stronger as she looked Quan in the eye. When I was serving the wine in the VIP lounge, I wasn't just pouring. I was watching. It's what I do. You have to know who's getting impatient, who's had too much, and who's looking for trouble. She turned to Tihu. The man in the silk suit, the one who attacked me, he had a custom gold lighter. It had a jade dragon eye. He kept tapping it on the table. Tihu's jaw clenched. He remembered the lighter, it was a gift the politician bragged about constantly. When the lights dimmed for the club's main set, I saw him slide it across the table, Joy continued, her wide eyes fixed on the memory. He didn't slide it to a guard. He slid it to you, Quan. You pocketed it before the lights came back up. A thank you for the coordinates of the supply route he was going to hijack. A heavy, dangerous silence filled the room. Tihu stepped out of the shadows, his presence a dark, suffocating force. He walked to Quan and reached into the man's tactical vest, pulling out a small, heavy object. He opened his palm. The jade eye of the dragon lighter caught the light, glinting with a cold, mocking green. Data doesn't lie, and neither does a witness who has spent her life noticing the things men like us think are beneath them, Tihu whispered, his voice deadly quiet. He looked at Joy, a flicker of respect and obsession in his gaze. She had given him the smoking gun. Quan's face went gray as the truth was laid bare. He had used his position to play both sides, but he had forgotten that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one serving the drinks. Tihu signaled his men, his body language once again that of the predator. The stone-cold boss had his proof, and as the guards dragged the traitor away, he turned back to Joy, his grip firm on her waist as he pulled her into the safety of his shadow. The council chamber was exactly what Joy expected, a tomb of dark wood, expensive silk, and 12 men who looked as though they had never known the warmth of the sun. As she stood beside Dang Tihu, her deep red satin dress felt like a flare of defiance against the oppressive sea of black suits. The air was thick with the scent of old tobacco and a lethal, simmering skepticism. Every eye in the room was fixed on her, an outsider, a waitress, the woman who had caused the dragon to break his most sacred laws. Tihu sat at the head of the table, his unbuttoned white shirt revealing the dragon tattoos that seemed to pulse with his controlled fury. He didn't hide his proximity to her, one arm was draped firmly across the back of her chair in a gesture that was both possessive and a warning to the men before him. This meeting was called to address your recent distractions, the eldest council member began, his voice like dry parchment. You've crippled a political ally, executed your second-in-command, and brought a civilian into our sanctuary. The word "a week" is being whispered in the halls, Tihu. Tihu didn't flinch. I am not weak because I eliminated a traitor who was bleeding our resources into the hands of a pervert, he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He slid the jade dragon lighter across the mahogany table, the proof Joy had uncovered. Quan was the one who was compromised. He sold our coordinates for gold while I was securing our future. The council members murmured, their skepticism shifting into a lethal calculation as they viewed the evidence. But the eldest remained unmoved. The ally you crippled still holds the keys to the West Coast ports. Hand the woman over to him as an apology, or you lose the syndicate's support. Business must remain business, Tihu. That is the law. Joy felt the world tilt. She looked at Tihu, her wide eyes searching his intense, conflicted face for the man she had seen on the balcony. This was the choice, the empire he had built on blood and isolation, or the woman who had taught him how to breathe again. Tihu stood up, his tall frame looming over the table with a terrifying, predatory grace. He didn't look at the council, his eyes were lowered toward Joy with a mix of obsession and an unyielding protectiveness. My father was weak because he trusted the wrong people, Tihu said, his words chilling the air. I am strong because I know who is worth the sacrifice. You tell me to follow the old laws? The old laws kept me lonely and blind. I am making new ones. In a move that shattered every tradition of the Chinese syndicate, Tihu reached down and took Joy's hand, lacing his fingers through hers in front of the most dangerous men in the city. She is not an apology, he declared, his voice echoing with absolute authority. She is my heart. And if you want her, you'll have to take her from the man who just realized love is the only thing worth more than survival. The silence that followed was heavy with the realization that the stone-cold boss was gone. In his place stood a man who would burn the world down to keep her safe. 6 months had passed since the night Dang Tihu stood before the council and declared that the old laws of the Chinsa syndicate were dead. The transition had been anything but clean, yet as Joy stood on the terrace of their new estate, she realized they had built something far more resilient than an empire of fear. She was no longer the wide-eyed waitress caught in a predator's gaze, she was the architect of a new dynasty. Joy wore a dress that was a stunning collision of their two worlds, white silk flowing in the evening breeze, adorned with intricate Ankara print details that honored her own heritage. Beside her, Tihu had discarded his black tailored suits for a traditional Korean hanbok, his dark hair styled back, revealing the dragon tattoos on his neck that no longer seemed like a warning, but a signature of a man who had finally found his home. The intense, conflicted expression that had once defined him had softened into something Joy had never thought possible, peace. The transition to the logistics firm is complete, Joy said softly, leaning back into him as his arm wrapped firmly around her waist. She had used her sharp, observant mind to help him move the syndicate's operations toward legitimate business, proving that her waitress eyes were better at spotting fraud than any professional auditor. Tihu rested his chin on her shoulder, his grip possessive yet tender. The council doesn't recognize the organization anymore, he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her skin. They say I've traded my teeth for a conscience. And what do you say? Joy asked, turning in his arms to look up into the eyes that had once been as cold as winter stone. I say that they were wrong about weakness, Tihu replied, a real smile finally reaching his eyes, the kind of smile he had once thought was a forgotten language. He reached out and tucked a stray braid behind her ear, his hand lingering against her cheek. In my old world, love was the fastest way to die. But with you, I've realized that love is the only thing that actually makes us strong. The city glittered below them, no longer a battlefield, but a landscape of possibilities. They had survived the betrayal of brothers and the judgment of kings to create a space where morality wasn't black and white, but a complicated, beautiful shade of gray. You changed all my rules, Tihu whispered, pulling her closer until their shadows merged into one. Good, Joy whispered back, her fingers tracing the ink on his chest. They were terrible rules. He laughed, a sound of genuine joy that filled the quiet garden, and promised her there would be no more kidnapping, only the choice they made every day to stand together. In the dangerous, complicated world they had rebuilt, that choice made all the difference. The stone-cold boss was gone, and in his place was a man who had finally learned how to live.